On the night of her wedding, while the guests downstairs toasted to the future Duchess of Ravenscroft. She had no intention of becoming the perfect Duchess. And by dawn, if everything went according to plan, she intended to disappear. The heavy doors of the bridal chamber closed behind her with a soft click. Moments later, Duke Alexander Ravenscroft entered the tall and impeccably dressed. He looked exactly as London society described him. Reserved. He removed his gloves without glancing at her. "Our marriage changes very little," he said evenly. "You will have every comfort this house can provide. In return, you will fulfill your duties as Duchess." "You forgot one thing." "What is that?" "This marriage was necessary." "How convenient for everyone except the bride." At last Alexander crossed the room and withdrew a key from his coat pocket. Clara's eyes followed the movement. Without explanation, he locked the chamber door. The metallic sound echoed through the room. Then he slipped the key back into his pocket. Because while the Duke believed he had trapped his bride, Clara had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for precisely this moment. Hidden beneath the false bottom of her traveling trunk were several banknotes she had secretly saved. Inside the hem of her cloak rested forged travel documents, purchased through a trusted family acquaintance. And tucked carefully into the sleeve of her wedding gown was a simple hairpin. Strong enough to pick a lock. She lowered her gaze to hide the flicker of determination in her eyes. "You seem very confident, Your Grace." "What does that mean?" Moonlight filtered through the tall windows. Carefully, she withdrew the hairpin hidden in her sleeve. The lock yielded faster than she expected. A soft click. Freedom waited just beyond the corridor. Clara gathered her cloak and moved silently through Ravenscroft Manor. She had nearly reached the servants' staircase when she heard something unexpected. Soft sobbing. She froze. The sound came from behind a partially opened door. Curiosity overcame caution. Inside sat a boy no older than 15. He stared down at a sketchbook resting in his lap. Several crumpled drawings littered the floor around him. "You should be asleep," Clara whispered. The boy nearly jumped. "What? I saw you open the lock. You know who I am. You are Julian." Society rarely mentioned him. No one ever seemed to know where he was. "I suppose this is the part where you tell me marriage isn't so terrible." "No." It was a short sound. "You really were planning to leave." "I won't stop you." Villages. Seaside cliffs. People laughing in marketplaces. "You painted these. They're foolish. They're impossible. I haven't left Ravenscroft Manor in nearly 3 years. You've been ill. Because everyone Alexander loves eventually leaves. Our parents died." He stopped trusting the world. Protection. The same word men often used when fear became control. "He won't let me study art. He says the world is dangerous." For the first time that night, Clara forgot about her own escape. She looked at the lonely boy before her. At the sketchbook filled with places he had never seen. At the dreams carefully folded away because someone else's grief had taught them both that love and freedom could not exist together. "What would you do," she asked quietly, "if you could leave?" "I'd go to London." Until this moment, she had believed she was the only prisoner in Ravenscroft Manor. She had been wrong. Then extended her hand toward Julian. "What if," she asked carefully, "we both left?" "You mean it? Fragile and dangerous. But Alexander would never allow it." Her voice steadied. "Then perhaps it's time someone stopped asking for permission." Neither of them noticed the shadow standing just beyond the doorway. Or the man who had heard every word. Because Duke Alexander Ravenscroft had come searching for his runaway bride. Only to discover that she hadn't been planning to save. She had been planning to steal the one person he had spent years trying to protect. For several long seconds, no one moved. Julian's face drained of color. Clara turned slowly toward the doorway. Duke Alexander Ravenscroft stood beneath the dim corridor light, one hand resting against the doorframe. He had removed his evening coat. His dark hair had fallen slightly out of place, yet the rigid control that defined him remained unmistakable. Only his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't furious. He looked wounded. "Leave us," he said quietly. "No." Alexander stared at his younger brother. "What did you say?" "I said no." Clara realized she had just witnessed something extraordinary. The frightened boy who barely dared dream of London had finally spoken. "You don't get to order me out anymore, Julian. You said people leave. I've just existed. I was protecting you from life. I watched everyone else grow up," Julian whispered. "I listened to people my age talk about schools and friends and dreams. I stopped asking because I knew the answer would always be no." Then Julian looked directly at his brother. "You weren't protecting me." As though those words had struck harder than any physical blow, minutes later Julian left the room. Not because Alexander ordered him to. Because he needed air. Needed distance. Clara remained standing near the fireplace. Alexander stared down at the abandoned sketchbook. His voice sounded different when he finally spoke. "Did you mean it? You don't understand. When our parents died," he said at last, Julian was 12. "Everyone suddenly expected certainty. I realized people leave. I couldn't stop our parents from dying. I could keep Julian safe." Because for the first time in years, he heard the truth hidden inside his own choices. Control had never been about power. It had been about fear. Clara looked at him carefully. "You know what frightens me most? Dreams shouldn't have to ask permission to exist." The following days transformed Ravenscroft Manor in ways neither of them anticipated. Clara stopped planning her escape. Not because she had abandoned it. Because Julian mattered now. Every morning she found him sketching by the windows. Every afternoon she encouraged him to talk about London. About galleries. About artists. About possibilities. At first, Alexander observed from a distance. He watched Julian laugh more frequently. Watched him speak without immediately apologizing. Watched Clara challenge every unspoken rule Ravenscroft Manor had quietly accepted. "You should show him your work," Clara said one afternoon. Julian nearly dropped his pencil. "Absolutely not. What work?" The younger man's face turned pale. "It's nothing. It's extraordinary." Alexander accepted them reluctantly, then fell silent. The first drawing captured the manor gardens beneath snowfall. The second showed villagers dancing during a harvest festival. The third depicted children flying kites beside the sea. Each piece carried warmth, movement, life. Alexander stared. "They're not professional." Julian blinked. "What?" His younger brother had created worlds despite never being allowed to explore one. "You should continue. So I can paint Ravenscroft Manor forever? So you can paint whatever you wish." Then Julian quietly excused himself. The moment he disappeared, Clara turned toward Alexander. "You've never said that before. I've spent years believing fear made me responsible. The feared Duke of Ravenscroft. The man society admired for his certainty. Who now looked utterly lost." "You can't change the past," she said gently. "But you can stop repeating it." A respected art instructor from London visited the neighboring county. He had connections to one of the city's finest academies. Julian's sketches impressed him immediately. This boy belongs in London. Then dimmed. Because everyone in the room knew what came next. Alexander would refuse. He always did. The art instructor departed. Silence followed. Julian folded the acceptance letter carefully. "It's all right. I understand. Julian." Alexander crossed the room slowly. "Money. Travel documents. Train tickets brand." Julian stared at them. "What is this?" Then at Clara. His voice trembled for the first time in years. "I cannot spend the rest of my life mistaking fear for love. You should go." Julian's eyes widened. "What? You mean it?" Then he turned toward Clara. From his pocket, he removed the iron key to Ravenscroft Manor's front gates. The same gates that had remained locked for years. He placed the key in her palm. I won't keep taking it from people I love. Then back at him. I think. Searching for words that had never come easily. I think love offered as a cage isn't love at all. Spring sunlight filtered through the windows. Julian looked between them. Because for the first time in Ravenscroft Manor, every door stood open. And every choice finally belonged to the people brave enough to make it. The morning Julian left Ravenscroft Manor, the sky was the color of pearl. Thin mist drifted across the estate grounds as servants loaded two modest trunks onto the carriage waiting outside. For years, Julian had imagined this moment. He had dreamed of London without ever believing he would truly see it. The city of artists. The city of crowded streets and endless possibilities. The city he had painted 100 times without ever setting foot inside it. Now that it had finally arrived, he found himself unable to move. I think I'm going to be sick, he muttered. Clara smiled gently. That's usually how people feel before their lives change. Were you frightened when you decided to leave home? Nearby, Alexander stood beside the carriage watching them in silence. He looked as composed as ever. Only the stiffness in his posture betrayed him. Julian had never traveled without him. Never made a decision Alexander hadn't approved. Now, for the first time, Alexander had chosen not to decide for him. Julian slowly approached his brother. For several seconds, neither spoke. You really mean it? What should I do? As though I have finally understood that I never had the right to stop you. You know, I never hated you. I know I made things difficult. But I knew why. I just wanted you to see me. Then, without warning, Julian stepped forward and embraced his brother. Alexander froze. He had not been hugged in years. Slowly, awkwardly, he returned the gesture. His hand pressed against the back of Julian's coat. I'm sorry, he whispered. Julian smiled through tears. I know. Alexander and Clara stood side by side watching it disappear down the long gravel road. He'll be all right, Clara said softly. You sound very certain. Then he noticed something strange. Clara wasn't walking back toward the manor. Her gloved fingers tightened around the handle of a small traveling case. You're leaving too? Clara turned toward him. Yes. Without accusation. Without anger. The winter wind moved through the gardens between them. I see. He had known this moment might come. Still, knowing something and surviving it were very different things. You said I was free to choose. No conditions. Then he looked at her directly. I would like you to stay. But I don't think love means asking someone to abandon themselves. You've changed, Clara whispered. I think I'm trying to. She hadn't expected this to hurt. It was the reason she had hidden money inside her traveling trunk. The reason she had learned how to pick locks. The reason she had entered this marriage expecting nothing. But somewhere between Julian's laughter and Alexander's quiet apologies, it had become complicated. Human. You once locked every door in this house, she said. Alexander glanced toward the manor behind them. I know. I think people deserve the dignity of choosing whether they stay. She stepped closer. Then reached into her purse. The iron key to Ravenscroft Manor rested in her palm. You gave this to me. No. I'd rather remember the day you opened them. Then Clara lifted her suitcase. I found a position in London. What kind of position? You've already planned everything. A genuine smile. When do you leave? But I think perhaps I've spent enough years letting fear decide what I do. Steam filled the air. Porters hurried along crowded platforms. Children laughed. Vendors called out greetings. Alexander stood beside Clara's carriage as though uncertain what came next. For most of his life, he had always known what to say. What to command. How to lead. Now words failed him. Finally, Clara turned toward him. You're welcome. Passengers began boarding. Alexander looked at her. No. I don't think it's goodbye. Softly. You've ruined me for certainty. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't promise impossible things. He simply stood there as the train began to move. Their eyes remained locked until distance finally separated them. Only when the station had emptied did Alexander realize something. Ravenscroft Manor was waiting for him. But for the first time in years he no longer feared returning to an empty house. Because loneliness was no longer the same as loss. Loss had taught him to close every door. 3 months later, as spring settled over the countryside, a letter arrived at Ravenscroft Manor. Alexander recognized the handwriting immediately, not Clara's. With trembling fingers he unfolded the note. Inside was a single sentence. London in spring looked nothing like Ravenscroft Manor. The city moved with restless energy. Street musicians performed beside busy markets. Children chased one another through public squares, while merchants called out prices from overflowing storefronts. Life existed everywhere. Untidy. Unpredictable. Alive. Alexander Ravenscroft stood outside the exhibition hall, with Julian's invitation folded neatly inside his coat pocket. For years he had avoided London whenever possible. Too many memories lingered here. Too many expectations. Too many reminders of the life he had once believed he understood. Yet as he climbed the stone steps toward the gallery entrance, he realized something unsettling. He wasn't afraid of London anymore. Inside, guests moved quietly through spacious rooms filled with paintings. Some paused to admire landscapes. Others debated artistic techniques in hushed voices. Alexander ignored all of it. His eyes searched the crowd. Then he saw him. Julian stood near the far wall speaking with a group of visitors. He looked taller, healthier, more confident. Gone was the timid boy who apologized before sharing an opinion. This Julian smiled easily, gestured enthusiastically while discussing his work. He belonged here. For a long moment, Alexander simply watched. Then Julian looked up. Seconds later, he was weaving through the crowd. "You came. You invited me." "Instead," Alexander said, "you look well." "So do you." Paintings lined the walls. Seaside cliffs beneath stormy skies. Women carrying flowers through village streets. Scenes filled with warmth and movement. Then Julian stopped before the largest canvas in the. Alexander stared. The painting depicted Ravenscroft Manor. Its gates stood wide open. Spring sunlight spilled across the gardens. A woman standing beneath blossoming trees. And a solitary man holding an iron key loosely in one hand. Above the painting rested its title. "You painted this. You taught me how to survive. Don't deserve this." Maybe not. But that's the wonderful thing about second chances. Someone else came. And forgot how to breathe altogether. Clara stood beside an open window speaking with two women. Sunlight illuminated strands of chestnut hair escaping her bonnet. She wore a simple blue dress. No jewels. No title announced her presence. Yet somehow she had never looked more extraordinary. His heart stumbled. Because Ravenscroft Manor had never been the same after she left. Neither had he. As though sensing his gaze, Clara looked up. Their eyes met. For a brief moment neither moved. Then Clara excused herself and crossed the gallery. "You came. I've heard that already today. And yet you're here." The familiar sound eased something inside him. "You look happy," he said quietly. "I am." No grand declarations filled the silence between breaths. No dramatic apologies. Only honesty. Finally, Clara asked the question that mattered. "Why did you come, Alexander?" Offering some excuse about Julian. The exhibition. Duty. Instead, he chose truth. "Because I wanted to see what your life looked like when it belonged entirely to you." And at Julian laughing among strangers who had become friends. At Clara standing confidently in a life she had built for herself. Then back at her. "And I think it's beautiful. You don't miss Ravenscroft Manor?" "But I don't think home is a place anymore." Then answered honestly. "The people who remind you to become better than fear." Outside, Church bells echoed through the city streets. Eventually, Clara said softly, "I never wanted to hate you." "You shouldn't have." "What? You deserved the chance to choose your own life. I would have had to accept it." "You really mean that?" "You've changed. I think I've simply stopped confusing love with possession. Talking. Not as Duke and Duchess. Not as strangers. But as two people learning each other without obligation." They spoke about Julian's paintings. The school. The ridiculous amount of sugar children seemed capable of consuming in a single afternoon. They laughed. They disagreed. They remembered. By the time they stepped outside, rain had begun to fall. Clara opened her umbrella. Alexander glanced toward the waiting carriage. Then back at her. "I should return to Ravenscroft tomorrow. But I think Julian would miss his benefactor." People hurried along the sidewalks. Life continued. Alexander looked at Clara. "I don't know what happens next. I don't hate not knowing. That may be the greatest miracle of all." He had rehearsed a dozen times and nearly abandoned completely. "Would you have tea with me tomorrow?" At the man who had once locked every door in his house because he feared losing the people he loved. At the man who had learned to let them walk away. At the man who no longer asked her to surrender pieces of herself in exchange for affection. Finally she smiled. "I think tea is a reasonable place to begin." Children from every background crossed through gates that remained permanently open. Alexander traveled frequently between London and Ravenscroft. Not out of duty, but choice. And on a rainy afternoon much like the one that had changed everything, Clara slipped her hand into his. "For someone who once locked every door," she said softly, "I finally understood something. You cannot ask someone to choose you while standing in front of the exit. And now if you stay. I know it's because you want to. It is." Love was opening the door, stepping aside. And discovering that sometimes the people meant for you chose to walk back in on their own. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe to Romance Stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. If you were Clara, would you have given the Duke a second chance after he finally learned how to love without fear?